Now this, to the bottom right there, you see one of the so-called Panzerschibene, which were these coastal battleships which were so popular in 1900, but turned out to be sort of a, I wouldn't say waste of money, but close to it. And then the big gun on the top right is the Moses, one of the two guns that sank Blücher. And then we have a machine gun. Now, these were some of the most important weapons we had in 1940. And that says something about what had happened, because all of these were ordered during the 1905 fight. So Oscarsborg was built before that. The gun was from 1898 and the torpedoes from 1905. So they were fairly old guns. Now, the good thing with a land-based gun on a fort is it's pretty powerful, even if there's old grenades. Panzerschibene, on the other hand, they were sunk with, unfortunately, right there. They were totally unprepared, and I don't think there hadn't been any big Norwegian military maneuvers. I think there was like one in the 20s or something, and maybe one in the 30s. So there was very little. The military was they had a lot of ideas, but they had very little experience in what could happen. And then to the bottom left is the Fokker CVD, which was our most numerous plane. It's a double deck, and most of our planes were double deck. Very few modern planes. So our military was almost like a World War I military, and of course, the German army in 1940 was one of the best, or probably the best army at that particular time. If we go to the next slide, which we already talked a little bit about. So when peace broke out, Norway and Denmark, we were on the winning side. Secondly, of course, the country were broke to a certain extent. Of course, the Germans had, which is not strange. They needed everything they could, so they took up with that. And but they, at least they had their full freedom. Finland had a lot of much more damage than Norway and Denmark had. And of course, with a certain extent, depend on Russian goodwill, which so they managed to keep their freedom. They couldn't join NATO or anything. Sweden, like I think Sweden and Switzerland and the US were probably the big winners. Now I'm talking about in an economic sense, because that's of course is the fourth pillar of modern Norway is the economy. So we came out to the war with a lot of challenges, but the good thing was there had been limited fighting in Norway and Denmark. Yes, there were some towns in northern Norway that was tragic, that had been more or less flattened, especially in 1944 when the Russians moved north from the north through Finnmark. There had been some bombing, so I think my mother, who grew up in Oslo and who was a teenager during the war, she remembered when they tried to bomb the Gestapo headquarters, which was the old police station in Oslo. Unfortunately, one of the bombs missed and it hit a trolley full of civilians. So she remembered, because she said she even remembered hearing the bang. So there was, of course, a lot of tragedies, but in a World War II sense, it was fairly small. Most of the infrastructure was intact. There's worn out train lines. Everything else, of course, wasn't a lot of money to use for maintenance. But all in all, Norway and Denmark came out with fairly well. Of course, Sweden also had its industry and so on, because they hadn't had any fighting on their land. And Denmark was a little bit like Norway, and then. But I think the situation was pretty good still, because we were very open. Everybody in Scandinavia realized we had to cooperate. We had been spending 400 years fighting each other up to 1814 with very little success, and was basically spent 500 years fighting and losing a lot of people, and moved the borders a few miles. So. With hindsight, and hindsight is, as we know, is hindsight and nothing more. Of course, it was we would have done better together. So after the World War II, Norway, Denmark had this feeling we cannot afford the military. We don't have resources to afford the military on our own, big enough to deter Russia or whoever would come. And of course, Russia was the most likely candidate. So they joined NATO, and the US, of course, gave a lot of military aid in those days. They had a lot of gear, of course, and so the Norwegian Army and Navy was pretty much set up with World War II equipment from the US and to a certain extent Britain. Only thing that you needed, which was outdated, was the Air Force. Of course, you had to buy new. An old ship and an old gun can still do damage, but an old plane is just a target for everybody else. So so that was that. But the other thing was the economic sense. And in the previous centuries, Scandinavia had been fairly poor. In the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, Scandinavia was a poor area. We were on the fringes weather-wise. You know, it doesn't take too much before the summer harvest is gone if you have a rainy, wet, cold summer. Now that had changed, and we could start working together and use the strengths. And we got this Nordic cooperation. You know, SAS, Scandinavian Airlines, probably the one everybody knows about. But the fact that for those of you who traveled around, you know, when you cross from Sweden to Norway or Denmark or Finland, except now under COVID, you can just drive straight across the border. And when I came here to the US, I had been here and I also took my master's here, but I moved here. I didn't plan to move here, but I went to California, but I was over 30, and then I met this girl from New York, and well, I'm halfway home now from California to Norway. So now we had a good time, and you know, our kids say so. Obviously, I will stay. But so when we moved to Norway, we lived a couple of 2.5 years in Norway, and actually our daughter was born there. And we drove to Sweden, and as we crossed over Svinesund, which I'm sure some of you have done, and when we crossed, I said to my wife, "So, welcome to Sweden." And she's like, "Is this Sweden?" Where's, you know, she couldn't understand. There was no customs, nothing. You know, you just drove on, and the only thing difference you could see was that they had this yellow instead of white on the traffic signs. So that's a good thing. So the Scandinavian countries really, there's of course several reasons that you change economically and politically, but they have all this. I think there was always a certain democratic tradition, not necessarily electing parliaments, etc., but in Europe, which is fairly heavily populated, small areas. If you were a nobleman, you had a bunch of soldiers, and you could basically keep track of your farmers. You couldn't do that in Scandinavia, maybe Denmark, but not in the northern, not in Norway or Sweden, at least not the northern parts. You know, there's no way you can justify or even afford to keep soldiers stationed all over the place because you want to force the farmers to pay you some kind of tax. You wouldn't get enough anyway. You wouldn't pay for the soldiers. So there was always a very independent streak in Norway, and we know from the 1600s, when the Danish king decided that Norway needed an army was in the 1600s, when he ordered the Norwegian army which had actually done well against the Swedish invasion, to move into Sweden. And the soldiers refused because they were all drafted farmers, and this was an area, of course, where there's no fixed borders like it is today, most places today. So if you were a farmer there, you know, half of your family was probably in Sweden. So they said, no way. And the king decided, well, we can't have that kind of soldiers. So now we need professional soldiers. So they got a lot of officers from the continent, etc. So I think that independence has always been there in Scandinavia. And now that after we started working together, all of Scandinavia has become very prosperous today. As you know, it's a very wealthy area of the globe, and it's not all because of oil. Oil has only been to Norway, and it didn't really come until the well, they started finding it in the 70s, but it didn't really have that much impact before the 80s. Then, of course, it started in the 90s, especially. All right, so this was my just trying a little of how Scandinavia was created, and it is, of course, a sad fact that most countries are, to a certain extent, at least, created by wars. Because wars have this sudden change, and it also makes for a